I'm thinking. Chris, thank you for that gracious, kind introduction. That was Actually, I was thinking with like his energy and his commentary, and I'm sure inspiration for so many locals proud of Spokane amongst across the state. I thought, what a tough act to follow. And I'm so glad that we discovered that I was in the wings. But no, in all seriousness, I do really appreciate Chris and his leadership and kicking this off with some fun and humor, and of course, for his leadership. And I am so pleased to be here tonight to help represent Boeing, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to get a chance to introduce our guest speaker. First, though, I'd like to share that we at Boeing were so deeply sorry for the loss of the life aboard Lion Air Flight 610 and Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302. These tragedies continue to weigh so heavy on our hearts. And we extend and will continue to extend our deepest condolences and sympathies to the crew and the passengers that were aboard. We know and have known for so long across our history that every person that steps on one of our airplanes puts their trust in us in the work that we do, and we are working so diligently and will continue to do so to earn and re-earn the trust of passengers around the globe. So in the week, and we will do that in the weeks and months ahead, so thank you. So, with that in mind, I do want to say again how delighted we are at Boeing to serve as the presenting sponsor of this year's Association of Washington's Business Spring Meeting. We appreciate that forums like these allow us to collaborate as business leaders to expand Washington's economic footprint. As you may know, and as was noted by several of the opening remarks, we play a pretty critical role in this state. We are super proud to be the state's largest private employer, with tens of thousands of employees whose jobs range from engineers to mechanics to supply chain experts and so many more. And nearly half of our global workforce resides here right in Washington state. We are equally proud of our 100-year history and our deep relationships across the state. And of course, more broadly than just our company, aerospace is just a major economic driver in Washington. The aerospace industry annually supports more than $21 billion in business activity, creating more than 240,000 jobs across the state. Our final assembly sites are well known, but our footprint in Washington state is actually much larger. And what I do right now is I have the opportunity to lead our fabrication organization. And it's just an awesome team of people that design and make all of the internal components and subassemblies that we do internally to Boeing. We have a workforce sites 10,000 people in Washington state, from Everett all the way down to a town called Frederickson and Puyallup. And as I said, they're just an awesome team, and they are deservedly very proud of what they do and the contributions that they make, not just to Boeing, but the communities that they serve in. Boeing also spends about $5 billion annually with nearly 2,000 Washington supplier and partners. And many of you are in the room tonight, and we're really proud to partner with you. So we're really proud to partner with AWB, Washington's largest and oldest statewide business association. But you're not here to listen to me. So with that, that leads me to tonight's keynote speaker, Ambassador Nikki Haley. She recently joined the Boeing Board of Directors. Very proud of that. So Nikki Haley is the former United States permanent representative in the United Nations. She served as a member of President Donald Trump's cabinet and the National Security Council. At the United Nations, Ambassador Haley ensured the American people saw value for their investment, introducing reforms that made the organization more efficient, transparent, and accountable. In a 2-year period, she negotiated over $1.3 billion in savings, including right-sizing UN peacekeeping missions to make them more effective and targeted, while improving their ability to protect civilians. In the UN Security Council, Ambassador Haley worked to defend Americans' interests and keep our country safe. She spearheaded negotiations for the passage of the strongest set of sanctions ever placed on North Korea for its nuclear weapons program, cutting off the regime's exports by 90% and its access to oil by 30%. Ambassador Haley also challenged human rights violators across the globe, standing up to the oppressive regimes in Iran and Venezuela and Syria and Cuba and Russia. During the U.S. presidency of the United Nations Security Council, she hosted the first ever session devoted solely to promoting human rights. Prior to becoming the 29th U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Haley was elected in 2010 as the first female and first minority governor of South Carolina. Under Governor Haley's leadership, South Carolina was a national leader in economic development. Known as the Beast of the Southeast, South Carolina's unemployment rate hit a 15-year low, saw over $20 billion in capital investment, and added new jobs in every single county in the state. She was there with us at Boeing from the beginning of our journey in South Carolina, and it is an understatement to say that Ambassador Haley's leadership and partnership were critical to the unprecedented success we have achieved in South Carolina. As governor, Nikki Haley was the catalyst for the economic growth and manufacturing renaissance that South Carolina is experiencing. We cannot put into words the gratitude that the people at the Boeing Company have for Governor Haley when she led the state through some of its most challenging times in decades. South Carolina, and quite frankly, any other state in the nation, could not have asked for a better governor. As was mentioned, we're thrilled to have her a member of our board of directors. On a personal note, she was born in Bamberg, South Carolina. She's the daughter of Indian immigrants and a proud graduate of Clemson University. In her first job at the age of 13, she kept books for her family's clothing store. Ambassador Haley and her husband, Michael, a major in South Carolina's Army National Guard and combat veteran, that definitely deserves a hooah, hooah. Have two children, Raina 20 and Naylan 17. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please help me extend a warm welcome to Ambassador Nikki Haley to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I was sitting backstage and thinking, I gotta tell Michael about Spokane. Like, that was like a fantastic run of successes. I was very impressed and just really happy for Spokane and all that's happening. So I thank you for the opportunity to speak with you tonight, and it is great to be here. I have always loved business. It's where I come from. It's where my heart is. So it's great to be with a group of people who I have a kinship with. When I was growing up, my mother started her own business. It was a retail clothing and gift store in South Carolina. It was a small family business in every sense of the word, started from scratch. When I was about 13, my mother's longtime bookkeeper announced that she was leaving. After a couple of weeks of not finding anyone, the bookkeeper was concerned. She had to train someone to take her place, and time was growing short. She asked my mom how she wanted to handle it. I happened to be walking by when they were having this conversation, and my mom grabbed my arm and said, "Train her, she'll do it." By the time I was 13 years old, I was doing taxes, keeping the ledger, balancing the expenses, and the bank account for my mom's business. It wasn't until I got to college that I realized that wasn't normal. Now I realize that was totally child labor, and I don't let them forget that. I tell you this story because, as many of you know, when you grow up in business, it gets in your bloodstream. You may go on and do other things, but you never really stop looking at the world like a business person. You never stop seeing the market opportunities, calculating the overhead. You learn the value of a dollar. When times are tough, you tighten up, reevaluate, and get creative. And when times are good, you don't celebrate because you know that bad times could happen again. And you learn a lot from government. Government can have your back, or it can stab you in the back. I would always talk about how hard it was to make a dollar and how easy it was for government to take it. I never forgot the lessons that I learned in my mom's business, and I used them as governor of South Carolina and as ambassador at the United Nations. From day one in the governor's office, I made it my mission both to support South Carolina business and to create the conditions that would bring new businesses and jobs to South Carolina. That meant fundamentally changing the relationship between government and our business community. I wanted to make it clear that government was there to serve the people and businesses of South Carolina, not the other way around. We started by changing the government culture. We had all state employees start answering the phones. "It's a great day in South Carolina. How may I help you?" They hated that so much. But we were in the customer service business. Time is money. We had every agency start to reflect the streamlining of their processes, saving South Carolina businesses time and money. We were determined to set businesses up to succeed, not regulate them into failure. Incentives are used by a lot of states, but what the people in New York who drove Amazon away don't get is that incentives are short-term. Businesses would rather have the right long-term environment than incentives that eventually run out. In South Carolina, we did that by passing strong tort reform laws, deregulation, and education reform. There's one episode that many of you here in Washington will remember. That's when the Obama administration's National Labor Relations Board tried to keep Boeing from creating thousands of jobs in South Carolina. Now, I suppose some people viewed this as a Washington State versus South Carolina battle, but it really wasn't that at all. It was an unnecessary fight, and in the end, both states won. The NLRB claimed Boeing's decision to locate a new assembly plant in South Carolina, which is a right-to-work state, somehow hurt the unionized employees in Washington State. We fought the decision, and we won. But it was a win for everyone. It was a win for the right of employers and not the government to freely decide where they want to do business and create jobs. As governor, I got actively involved in economic development projects. Every CEO had my personal cell phone number, and they knew they could call me anytime. I put myself in the shoes of CEOs. I understood the risk they were taking by investing in our state. We created partnerships between schools, manufacturers, and government to create a trained workforce tailored to each company's needs. I told them they were getting me as an employee for free. All we asked were two things in return: that they take good care of our South Carolina people, and that they used our South Carolina small businesses to do their local needs. The results were incredible. We attracted over $20 billion in new capital investment to South Carolina. We were number one in foreign capital investment, number one in exports. By the time we ended our administration, South Carolina was building airplanes by Boeing, cars by BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Volvo, 5 new international tire companies. Kim already said it, business and trade magazines were calling South Carolina the beast of the Southeast, which I love. And our state unemployment hit a 15-year low. Government's responsibility is not to pick winners and losers. It is to create the playing field that allows businesses to succeed or fail. Right now, the United States is on a roll. Regulations have been rolled back, unemployment is down, manufacturing jobs are up, the stock market is up. But it's not hard to see the threats that loom on the horizon. Many people are deeply concerned about climate change, and it is a serious issue. The question is, what will we do about it that doesn't cripple our economy? Businesses don't need onerous regulations to be good stewards of the environment. They need the right conditions to continue to innovate, because innovation is ultimately the key to ending man-made climate change. Many manufacturers are proactively, on their own, changing their building and manufacturing standards to protect the environment. We saw this over and over in South Carolina. Even though it was more expensive, businesses wanted to do their part to the betterment of the environment. Government needs to provide more positive incentives for businesses to do the right things. And we need to applaud them when they do, not demonize them, all as enemies of the earth. Internationally, our foreign policy has been redirected. I saw firsthand at the United Nations how governments take the United States for granted. For too long, the United States had been paying most of the bills at the UN and not asking for much in return. Countries would badmouth us and vote against us, and then turn around and have their hands out, waiting for foreign assistance. From day one at the UN, I came out and said that we would have the backs of our allies, and we were taking names of those who were against us. Our goal was no longer to have every country like us. We were no longer going to continue to help countries that were actively going behind our back against us. We will always give humanitarian assistance. That's who we are as a country. That will never change. But everything else was on the table. Pakistan is a good example. The United States was giving Pakistan $1 billion a year in military and security assistance. But why would we give $1 billion a year to a country that harbors terrorists that turn around and try and kill our U.S. soldiers? The administration stopped the funding to Pakistan and ended the U.S. rewarding them for bad behavior. We've made many positive changes in foreign policy, and we're making progress in international trade too. President Trump is right when he says the U.S. has been taken advantage of in trade agreements way too long, and that's changing. When you change things, there are always going to be bumps in the road. But at the end of the process, you have a better road. That's what I expect we will see with China and other countries on the trade front. But the greatest threat to U.S. businesses and our economy today does not come from overseas. It comes from within. Many people don't realize this. It needs to be said over and over again. Capitalism is the greatest force for ending poverty and lifting up human beings in the history of the world. The percentage of people living in extreme poverty, starvation level poverty, in the United States has declined 80% since 1970. The liberal Brookings Institution has estimated that if these trends continue, extreme poverty will effectively be eradicated by 2030. If there's one thing you can take away from this talk today, it's this phenomenon. Because it's not due to the United Nations or foreign assistance. It's due to capitalism, and we need to remind ourselves and others of that. America's dangerous flirtation with socialism is not just in our colleges and universities. It's in the media. It's on the internet. It's in Congress. Capitalism has been declared irredeemable. Former businessmen, now running for president, reject the term capitalist. The fact is, the market economy has benefited the entire world, but it has benefited Americans more than most. We all have an obligation to explain to the next generations of Americans the importance of capitalism. We have an obligation to remind everyone that if you care about global poverty, if you care about childhood disease, literacy, even the environment, you should support capitalism. We all have an obligation to educate young Americans about where socialism leads, especially those who have traveled to countries that claim to be socialist. It leads not just to poverty, but to oppression. It leads to Venezuela. It leads to gulags. America's collective amnesia on this point is becoming a real threat. And it's a threat that comes at us, not from abroad, but from within. Critics of capitalism always seize on two features. The first is that there are some bad actors who engage in a corrupt self-dealing and manipulate the system to their own advantage. We saw that in the housing crisis in the last big recession, and we see it in other places. But that's not the fault of capitalism. That's a distortion of capitalism, and it's often illegal. When business people commit crimes, they should go to jail, and they should never be saved by a government bailout. But again, look at the alternative. If you want to see corruption on a truly massive scale, it's not in the free and capitalist countries. It's in places like China, where basic human rights are crushed at every level. The second feature of capitalism that critics always point to is that it results in unequal outcomes. That's true. Income inequality is a feature of a free economy. As a society, we rightly take steps to help people at the lowest end of the economic scale through a myriad of government support services. And we rightly invest a great deal in education and give people better opportunities in life. Those things absolutely must continue and should be strengthened. But let's not lose sight of the fact that it is in capitalist countries that poor people have experienced by far the most economic advancement. Compare it with the so-called socialist paradise of Venezuela, where everyone is equal, yes, but they are equal in their poverty and their starvation. Capitalism is not perfect. We know that. But it is the best, most vibrant, and fairest economic system ever devised. We should never shy away from saying that. I believe there are great things in America's future, but they are not automatic. All of us have the responsibility to keep alive the principles that have made us the most powerful and generous nation on earth. Speaking for myself, I will never forget the lessons that I learned in my mother's store, and I will never stop being the loud and proud ambassador of these principles to my country and the world. And I hope everyone here today will join me for ourselves and for all Americans. Thank you.
Deserved standing ovation. And
Thank you very much.
Thanks
That
for
was
those
very nice.
inspirational remarks. And I know I speak for this entire room that we're thrilled that we get a chance to continue the conversation and hear about your leadership experiences and perspective with some dialogue. So where to begin? Let's see. So when you were a UN ambassador, can you distill it down to the number one challenge you faced?
Besides Russia? I think that at the UN, there were obviously multiple challenges. But for me, when I walked in, I felt like the biggest challenge was the culture. There was a resentment of the U.S. They would kind of step all over the U.S. They took us for granted. And it was really trying to change the culture of the UN to let them know that everything they had been doing was stopping as of that day, and that there was a whole new culture that we were going to have at the UN.
So, as former governor, you understand firsthand the difficulties of getting a legislator and an executive to agree on just about anything. I'm sure it feels at some times. But as we know, you were able to really get a lot of things done. What do you think politicians can learn from the experience of governors like yourself?
I think that they just need to remember who they work for. I mean, results matter. You can talk all day long, but nobody wants to hear someone talk. They want to see what you get done. And there would be times where we would have total chaos in South Carolina, but I would put both sides in a room and say, we're not leaving until we're finished. And I'll tell you, the one thing that bothered me the most was when government shut down. And it bothered me for two reasons. First of all, Congress has just one job. That's like their only job, is to balance the budget. And not only did they not do their one job, they let government shut down and they went home with pay and left every other government official and public servant had to go home without pay. That's disgusting. I can't even, if all of the public servants that worked for me, they lived paycheck to paycheck. It really is a sacrifice when people serve and work in their government. And the idea that they just said, oh, we'll pay you when government opens back up. Well, that doesn't matter if somebody has to pay the rent. And this government shutdown was 6 or 8 weeks. So the lesson of that is, and I personally think, if you had taken away Congress's paychecks, they would have fixed that just like that. But the other part that you may not have thought of that really bothered me was not how they took advantage of public servants and disregarded them, but I was watching the Security Council. And usually you have your ambassador in the chair and you have your experts behind you. And every country does that. And when I looked, the acting ambassador was in the chair with no people behind him. What do you think the rest of the world thinks of that? Because that image was weak. I know without question Russia and China took advantage of that situation and tried to get as many things through as they can. Those are the things we have to think about. So when it gets about politics, we have to remind every elected official, this isn't about you. This is about results and getting things done. And I think we have to constantly remind them of that.
Absolutely. So speaking of tough negotiations in the likes of China and Russia, you sat on the United Nations Security Council with many countries who didn't always make things easy for you and certainly didn't have our country's best interests in mind. How did you successfully negotiate with countries like China and Russia in that situation?
You know, when I was growing up in South Carolina, we were the only Indian family in a small southern town. My father wears a turban. My mother wore a sari. They didn't know who we were, what we were, or why we were there. So when we would come home from school, after being bullied, my mom would tell me, your job is not to show them how you're different. Your job is to show them how you're similar. And it's amazing what I did as a 5-year-old on the playground, I did as governor, and I did as UN ambassador. So when we had issues that we had to solve, I would first talk about all the things that we agreed on, and that would get them to settle down. That would get them to realize that something could happen. And then I would go in to talk about the challenges. And so, oddly enough, that 5-year-old lesson had treated me well at the UN. And I think you always have to look at a situation, not in what you want and where you want to go, but think about it from their point of view. For the North Korean sanctions, China, I didn't talk about why the U.S. wanted them to do this and that they needed to do it. I knew the two fears of China were They didn't want war on the peninsula, and they didn't want a massive amount of North Koreans to come into their country. And so when you know what they're scared of, then you talk in terms of that, and you talk in terms of, we have to do this to keep the North Koreans from coming into your country. We have to do this so that we don't have nuclear war break out. And I think that that really was a lot of understanding who my challenge was, and then the approach to make them think it was their idea.
Pretty powerful, to say the least, from your childhood and flash forward to being on the world stage, years later. So it's hard to believe, I think, for all of us, but we're already in the midst of a presidential election. I know this is on the mind of many of us. Can you give some of your insights on where you see American politics heading over the next couple of years?
So I'm not a pollster or a political professional, so I'll just give personal views. It will be very interesting to see if we see a repeat of the Republican primary in the Democratic primary. I think right now what we're seeing is, in the Republican primary, we had a lot of talent on the stage, a lot of people running, and it was hard to notice like a lot of people because there were so many, and we saw it just going further and further to the right. You switch it, now you've got a Democratic primary, a lot of talent on that stage, but you're seeing it go further and further to the left and getting more and more extreme in their views and more disassociated from where the moderates are. And so I think that it will be interesting to see if Democrats learn from what the Republicans went through, and they should kind of look and take the lessons from what we did right, what we did wrong as they go forward. But it's certainly going to be interesting to watch. I think that the more extreme and more liberal the Democrat is, the stronger the chances President Trump wins. I think if there's more of a moderate Democrat, then I think there's going to be a real race.
Yeah, and so in terms of our nation being so politically divided today, and you talked about this a bit, about the threat of socialism conjuring up in our country today, can you reflect on where you see our country right now, and how can we move forward and be more united?
So I honestly think this is probably as politically toxic as it's ever been. The way you know that is you can watch in Congress, if anybody puts a good piece of legislation down on the table, everybody wants to know whose it is before they decide whether they want to support it. That's when you've hit kind of a low. And I think that the banner back and forth and the division back and forth has gotten so toxic, and the language back and forth. And it wasn't that long ago that I heard parties referring to the others as evil and people referring to each other as evil. I've seen evil. I've been to the Democratic Republic of Congo, where they use rape as a weapon of war. I've been to South Sudan and heard the stories of women talking about how the military grabbed their babies from their arms and threw them in a fire. I've been on the Simon Bolivar Bridge between Venezuela and Colombia and watched people who walked hours in the sun holding their babies to get, bless you, to get the one meal they might get that day. The average Venezuelan adult has lost 24 pounds. I've seen pictures of children who were killed by chemical weapons from Assad. That's evil. All this is politics. It's just differing of opinions. It's just different ideas. And at some point, everybody needs to step back and remember to be grateful. Because on our worst day, we are blessed to be in America.
Talking about trade a little bit more, as we've talked, we're really proud, Washington, to be such a great exporter and such a trade-driven state. So securing these new trade agreements like USMCA, amongst others, is absolutely critical to the state's employers. Can you give perspective on the prospects and timing of these critical agreements?
I mean, if you want to see how harmful politics is, you can watch it with the trade agreement now. Here you have the USMCA that take the politics out. This affects so many businesses, so many people who have jobs, the economy, everything else. So they finally got the negotiation done. And now we've got a political structure where the Democrats are saying they're not going to take it up because of the labor laws in Mexico. You've got Mexico and Canada that have said the U.S. has to pass it first because we can't go back and do it. We're all running out of time. Mexico goes through and literally very quickly changes their labor laws because the U.S. has to get it done. And they still aren't taking up USMCA. You should call your congressperson, you need to contact your senators. This is inexcusable. This is something that has to happen, and we literally are running out of time, all because it's about political points back and forth. And no parties are innocent in this, but everybody is guilty if this doesn't pass. Because basically Canada and Mexico will look and say, we're not going to do this, and then there's no deal. And that's when everybody loses.
That's right. Important for us to all take action. I appreciate that. So, where do you see U.S.-China relations headed from here?
So China really has been having their way with us for a while. And I think that to look at the U.S.-China relations, we have to really look at the whole array of where they are. We have to keep an eye on them. It's a serious concern at this point. They are building up their military extensively, and for that, from a national security perspective, we need to be very, very careful. They are, when you look at a trade perspective, they're really trying to push on their trade. I'll get back to that in a minute. I think if you look at the fact of they're investing all over the world, they're going into these little countries and investing and giving them infrastructure, but they're not assimilating into those communities, and they really are browbeating those countries. I saw it at the UN. If they weren't voting the right way, they were threatening to pull the money, and they're leaving those countries with a mountain of debt. They continue to steal intellectual property. We continue to have the issues with the fact that they don't respect the fact they don't do anything on their own. They just reverse engineer everything that we and others do. So China has to be watched very carefully. And the other side of it is they have now gotten into this strange surveillance situation where they are now having the abilities to watch all of their people and their movements. They have 1 million Muslims in a re-education camp. They're called the Uyghurs, in a re-education camp to change the way that they think. So if you look at that and you look at the fact that President Xi just basically made it so that he can be there forever, it's a concern that we have. Now, when it comes to the trade deal with China, I do think we're going to get a deal. And the reason I think we're going to get a deal is because both President Trump and President Xi need this to happen for their constituencies. There's the political will to get it done. So while they're fighting back and forth over it, I think they have to get there. The number one fight that they're having is the accountability on if China doesn't do what they're supposed to, if they don't comply with the theft and all of those other things. That's where the breaking point is that they have right now, and we really have to have that accountability. So that's the one thing I hope stays in there and that they push through, but I do think we get a deal at the end of this.
Great, thank you. Well, your personal background is so fascinating, and with your parents coming to the United States from India, and being the daughter of immigrants, what has that taught you? I mean, how does your parents' story, your childhood experience, how does that shape your perspective on the current immigration debate in our country?
So, our parents, growing up, there literally wasn't a day that our parents didn't remind us how blessed we were to be in America. They came here legally. They put in the time. They put in the price. They put in the sacrifice to come here for the opportunities that were America. They are offended by anybody that tries to come here illegally. And you can talk to any legal immigrants. They are the most patriotic people you will ever see because they had to fight to get here. And we have to seriously look back and say, if you won't follow the laws to get in, why would you follow the laws when you're here? And the other side of that is, we are a country of laws. The second we give up being a country of laws, we lose everything this country was founded on. This is all about the fact that we want as many immigrants in this country as possible. They make us better. Immigrants are the fabric of America. We need their skill, we need their talent, we need their culture, we need what they make America to be. So all that has to be done is to fix the processes of us knowing who's in the country, what their background is, and just know their story. That's all this is. It's not about stopping people, it's about processing them in a way that we can get them through and still be comfortable. I mean, I think the one job of a president is to protect your people. And I think we have to remember that when you've got 100,000 people that were on the border just last month, you can't process that many people. There's got to be something that happens. And a lot of people don't realize these caravans that were coming from Honduras and Guatemala, the U.S. worked with the UN, and we had medical staffs along the way. We had security along the way because people were getting incredibly sick. There was trafficking. We did everything we could, but at some point, there has to be a process in play. And I know they talk about refugees and asylum seekers. To put that part in perspective, South Carolina was involved in the federal refugee program. We would take in people who had been persecuted, those that were afraid of death. There was a process that happened. And if you remember, this all kind of started with the Syrian refugees several years back, because all of a sudden there was this hoopla about who was going to take them, who wasn't going to take them. And I, as governor at the time, called the FBI director at the time, who was James Comey, and I said, okay, help me out with this. Let me go back. The way the refugee program worked, when my husband was deployed to Afghanistan, when his unit came back, their number one goal was to make sure they got their 2 interpreters out because they'd be killed, because they kept them safe. The refugee program allowed those 2 interpreters to come. They now have great jobs, they're taking care of their families, they're Americans. When the Syrian refugee situation happened, and I called Jim Comey, I said, tell me, we're part of this refugee program. How is this different? He said, we literally don't know anything about these people. We have no background. We have no history. We don't know anything. And at that point as governor, I said, we can't take them because I couldn't keep my people safe. So I think we have to realize this is just about knowing who's here so that we can protect ourselves, but not stopping people from coming. But there has to be a process in place, and this is where I'll vent again. Congress needs to get in there and deal with immigration. This is their job. This is a matter of national security. They have to go in there and do it. But they're not debating that. And I think that's a real problem, and both sides are to blame for that.
So let's talk a little bit about leadership. Whether it was as governor in South Carolina or on the global scale, I mean, you've had a ton of success, but notwithstanding a lot of challenges. But you're so known for leading by example, keeping a civil tone. What do you think of the divisive political rhetoric, and can we get back to civility?
Look, we're going through growing pains now. I think that's, we always go through certain times where it's a little bit more toxic than others, and I think this isn't our finest hour, but I think I am an optimist. I believe in the goodness of people. At the end of the day, we always get it right. We do. We continue to go through the pain, and we get to the really good parts, and I think that same thing's going to happen. You look at the economy, you look at where we are in terms of opportunities and jobs and unemployment in the stock market. There's so much to be proud of, But we have to get through these tough things like immigration. We've got to get through these tough battles with the budget. We've got to get through some of those hard points, and we will. We'll get through those too, and then we'll end up fine on the other side.
So, given your broad experience, I know the people in the audience really want to hear your thoughts on how the business community can work to improve the business climate at the state, federal, or even international levels. Can you share some perspective on that?
Be involved. Your voice matters. There's nothing that scares an elected official like a business person. Because if you're a business person, you hire a lot of other people, you work with a lot of people, and there's a lot of votes in your orbit. And my big thing is we tend to elect people because they've been there for a while and we like them and we see them in the grocery store, but they've got such a great family. It's their voting record. It's whether they're working for you. It's whether they're fighting for you and getting things done. Are they giving a great speech and saying nice things, or are they actually working for you? And I think businesses have the best bully pulpit there is. This USMCA affects all of us in this room. Every one of you has to go and make sure that you're in front of those people and let them know it needs to be debated. And don't just let it be you. Everyone that works with you needs to contact them and let them know this is their job, they have to get it done. Immigration, they've got to get it done for the good of the country to get it moving. The best thing you can do is use the power of your voice. And I think what businesses tend to do, and I can say this because growing up in business, I saw this happen, they don't want to upset anybody. In business, we're all about, addition. We want as many people to come in. We want to have good business. We want to keep things going. And so we don't want to rock, the apple cart. But I think we need to remember there are times where you have to take a side. And I think that putting the pressure on your elected officials is doing good for the community. It's doing good for your state. It's doing good for our country. Hold them accountable. They expect to be held accountable, and make sure that they're working for you. But know that the power of the business people's voice is so incredible if you use it.
Well, and let's talk a little bit, given this audience, back to kind of your state experience. And you focus so much, as was mentioned, about good government and making South Carolina the state that had raised you to be, so great and so business friendly. So can you give us a little color about, what was it like before you stepped into your role, and what steps did you take to achieve, that success?
So when I was campaigning for governor, that's when I saw that, South Carolina was the big textile basket for a long time. And when all the textile business went overseas, South Carolina was left empty. And the lesson was you never want to have all your eggs in one basket. You need to diversify. But South Carolina had put so much weight on the textiles. So when I went around and campaigned, everybody was so down on South Carolina and just criticized South Carolina for all kinds of things. And so when I became governor, I was trying to figure out what in the world am I going to do to change the culture of the state? Because if they don't say nice things, I can't have a CEO show up and everybody talking bad about the state. I had to have cheerleaders. And that really was, I went to the woman that was at the head of the governor's office and answered all the calls from the public. And I said, just try this for me. And she said, what? And I said, the next person that calls, say it's a great day in South Carolina, how may I help you? And she looked at me and she said, really? I said, just try it. I want to see what happens. And she did, and the person on the other side of the line said, well, thank you. It is a good day in South Carolina. Well, then before you know it, I started saying it in front of every speech. I started saying it everywhere I was. It was a great day in South Carolina. And still to this day, South Carolinians are so proud and so excited because they saw they had it in them. They saw that they were able to bring businesses, and they saw that people did like to do business there. And the business environment matters. And we talked about that earlier. The environment of a state has to allow businesses to have more cash in their bottom line. And the reason is, If businesses have more cash, what do? They hire more people. It's an automatic economy driver, and it's an automatic good for everyone in the state. So if businesses are healthy, everything is good. And so for a state, on the local level, at the state level, you have to keep that environment as strong as possible, and don't get into the regulations, and don't get into the more taxes, and don't get into all of these burdens that can really weigh a business down.
Great outcomes for sure. And I'm remiss, we're almost out of time, so I'd love to end it on a personal note if you don't mind. So, governor, ambassador, member of the president's cabinet, most importantly, you're a mom, you're a military spouse, and we've also heard that you're an honorary Clemson football coach. Is that true?
Depends on what Davo says during the day.
So, at the end, I think we all want to know, how do you do it all? How do you balance your family schedule, your personal life with all of these professional obligations?
Well, I first have to tell my Clemson football story, right? So I am a graduate of Clemson, national champions, in case I need to remind all of you, go Tigers.
Wow.
And so literally for years, I did as governor and I did as ambassador. I text Dabo before every game and give him advice. And so I'll say, text him and say, Dabo, y'all aren't protecting Sunshine enough, the quarterback. You're not doing enough to protect Sunshine. You've got to make sure those guys have his back. Or, Dabo, what was that? Why, and just say those things. And he's so great because he always texts back and he just says, go Tigers. So then after every game, I text him and say, great game, can't wait till next weekend, all of that. And so he's so sweet. When I stepped down from the UN, and decided not to do that, he texted me and he said, I just want you to know we might have a football coaching position if you're interested. And I responded and said, be careful what you wish for. So having said that, look, there is a lot on top of everything you said. Michael and I also take care of my parents. They're both in their 80s. My mom has Parkinson's. So there are a lot of different levels in our life and a lot of things that we are responsible for. But at the end of the day, I was always able to do my job because I kept family close. If I was a good mom and a good wife, I knew I'd be a good governor, or I knew I'd be a good ambassador. And so it was always a priority to take care of family. I made sure when I was governor, we were home having dinner together 4 to 5 nights a week. As Friday nights were Haley family fun nights, and weekends was just family time. And I think that when you prioritize your family, everything else falls into place. If something's not right with your family, nothing works. And so for me, just being able to keep family close has always just kept me in a good place.
I so regret to share we're out of time. I know I speak for all of us here. We could listen to you so much longer. So will you please join me again in thanking Ambassador Haley for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
That was so wonderful.